The first time the soldiers saw her, they thought it was a ghost. The humid jungle of Bentry province in South Vietnam had a way of swallowing men whole, bending reality into shapes that didn't belong. January 17, 1960, dawned like any other dense mist, the scent of rotting vegetation, insects droning over stagnant water. But what emerged from the rivers and rice paddies was anything but natural. 5,000 women appeared from villages along the Mekong Delta, armed with nothing but carved bamboo sticks shaped to mimic rifles. They moved like shadows made flesh, disciplined, silent, and terrifying. Inside the fortified positions, trained American soldiers' modern weapons, decades of strategy, millions of dollars worth of firepower felt their confidence evaporate. It was not a battle they could win. Their own minds betrayed them first. The orchestrator of this impossible event was a woman they would only later know as Nguyen Thi Dinh, a figure so terrifying that even decades later, veterans hesitate to speak her name. She was not supernatural, but her understanding of human fear, honed over decades of observing cruelty, exploitation, and systemic oppression, was more deadly than any weapon. She had learned that fear, when cultivated with precision, could become a force of nature. That day in Bentry, she didn't just defeat soldiers. She broke the reality they believed to be unshakable. Their minds, trained to calculate threats, were blindsided by a phenomenon designed to operate beneath reason at the level of instinct, at the level of panic that pulses in your veins before thought can catch up. Nguyen Thi Dinh's rise was not born of ideology but of observation of trauma absorbed and transformed into mastery. From witnessing public executions as a child under French colonial rule to surviving imprisonment that shattered the psyche, she had catalogued every way a mind could be bent, every weakness that fear could exploit. And she turned that knowledge into power, a system of psychological warfare so sophisticated that American intelligence, for decades, refused to acknowledge its creator. Classified files remain buried, sealed as too dangerous to release. What you are about to hear is not the sanitized history of textbooks or war documentaries. It is a descent into truths deliberately buried, a revelation that challenges the foundation of what you believe about power, fear, and control. Nguyen Thi Dinh didn't just fight battles. She rewrote the rules of warfare, turning the human mind into a battlefield itself. By the end of this story, you will understand why some knowledge is suppressed, why the most dangerous weapons are never mechanical, and why some figures exist in history only as whispers for those brave enough to seek them. Nguyen Thi Dinh was born into a world designed to crush hope. March 15, 1920, Luong Hoa Commune, Gayong Tram District. The youngest daughter of a peasant family, she entered life under French colonial rule, a regime not just of oppression, but of theater. Public executions were not anomalies. They were entertainment. Villages could vanish overnight, swallowed by the machinery of fear, leaving only whispered rumors in their wake. For most children, such horrors would be paralyzing. For her, they became lessons in the architecture of terror. She watched, silent, as lives were dismembered with deliberate precision. She noticed the audience more than the victim, how the observer's gaze, the twitch of a muscle, the shiver of panic, could be manipulated. Her first education was in the invisible forces that bend human behavior, in the invisible levers of the mind. By age 7, she understood something most adults never grasp. Fear is a weapon, and it can be sharper than any blade. It penetrates deeper when it is atmospheric, when it seeps into the rhythm of daily life, silent and relentless. The French perfected this, sowing dread like seeds across the delta, letting it grow unseen until entire communities were paralyzed by anticipation, by the invisible hand of terror. For Dinh, her childhood name, these lessons were both cruel and precise. Each scream she heard, each act of punishment orchestrated before her eyes, was catalogued. She began to understand patterns, which human responses could be predicted, manipulated, and eventually controlled. Her transformation from peasant girl to instrument of psychological warfare was accelerated by personal tragedy. In 1938, she married Nguyen Thi Dinh, a man of charisma and revolutionary purpose. Their union should have been a sanctuary, but in October 1939, the French shattered it. Dinh, 9 months pregnant, witnessed a pre-dawn raid in which her husband was beaten unconscious. Blood pooled at her feet. She hid, helpless, holding a child that had yet to be born, learning firsthand that human cruelty has no bounds and that fear can be engineered to break even the strongest will. When her husband died in prison months later, she understood something critical. Those who wield fear often underestimate the ways it can be mirrored back, turned inward, sharpened into a weapon of retaliation. By the time she was herself arrested in 1940, separated from her infant son, she had already begun observing the mechanics of suffering. Prison became her laboratory. Isolation, sensory deprivation, hunger, and despair revealed patterns of human collapse. Some men crumbled under physical pain. Others broke under the sound of a child's cry or the silence of a cell. Every reaction, every breakdown became a formula, a blueprint she would later apply to an entire army. What the world would come to see in 1960 was not brute force, it was a mind trained to manipulate fear at a scale most could not imagine. A mind forged in the furnace of cruelty and honed by survival. Den emerged from prison not broken, but sharpened. Her body bore the scars, yes, but her mind had become something the French and later the Americans could not anticipate. She understood fear not as chaos, but as a system, a tool, a force to bend others into her design. And in the Mekong Delta, where rivers licked the edges of civilization and jungle shadows hid secrets older than memory, she would put that knowledge into practice, orchestrating horrors so effective that entire military units fled before bullets were fired. By 1943, Nguyen Thi Dinh had returned to a world transformed. South Vietnam was no longer just a colony, it was a chessboard of occupying powers, resistance movements, and fractured loyalties. Japanese forces moved like shadows through villages still haunted by French terror, while revolutionary fervor simmered beneath the surface, ready to ignite. But Dinh did not simply join this struggle. She redefined it. She understood that physical courage alone could not defeat modern armies. Firearms, strategy, numbers, these were secondary to the weapon she had spent her life perfecting: the human mind. Her first initiatives within the Viet Minh were deceptively simple. She organized women across Binh Tri province into units that could move silently, strike unpredictably, and vanish without a trace. But what truly set her apart was the layering of fear psychological operations designed to unsettle before any combat even began. Rumors, whispered at night in the villages, suggested that forces capable of unnatural feats prowled the jungles. Stories spread of women who could vanish and reappear like phantoms, of impossible victories over heavily armed soldiers. These were not myths. They were deliberate manipulations, engineered by Dinh to precondition the minds of enemy troops. Every step she took was calculated. The bamboo sticks carved to mimic rifles, the silent approach through the mist, the orchestration of noise and shadow, they were all designed to bypass logic, to trigger the primitive survival instincts of soldiers trained to rely on technology and firepower. She observed how fear could cascade through a group like an infection, how panic became contagious. A single soldier fleeing in terror could unravel an entire platoon. And she made sure it did. The Delta itself became a theater of her design. Every river bend, every rice paddy, every dense grove of palm trees part of the stage, ready to amplify dread with natural acoustics and visual distortions. Her tactics were deeply rooted in observation. She had studied broken prisoners, the predictable rhythms of trauma, the signals that indicated when a mind was about to snap. She now applied these lessons to hundreds, then thousands. Soldiers confronted by Dinh's units reported a surreal experience. The sense of being hunted by impossible numbers, of their reality bending, of time stretching and compressing under the pressure of imminent threat. Their senses betrayed them. Their training became irrelevant. Fear became the weapon, and Dinh had mastered it fully. It was during these early campaigns that whispers began to circulate among American and South Vietnamese officers. They called her a ghost, a witch, a terror that could not be quantified. Yet Dinh was methodical, scientific, disciplined. Violence alone was insufficient. She understood that true domination required breaking the enemy's confidence before they ever raised a weapon. By the time the Americans arrived in force, Dinh had already created an entire ecosystem of terror, tested and perfected over years of observation, loss, and survival. She was not just a commander. She was an architect of the invisible battlefield, one built entirely inside the human mind. By the late 1950s, Nguyen Thi Dinh's reputation had begun to ripple far beyond the villages of the Mekong Delta. The Americans, flush with confidence and technology, believed their soldiers could crush any resistance with firepower and discipline. They were wrong. Bentry Province became her canvas, the Delta her instrument, and fear her signature. It was here, in the oppressive humidity, where visibility rarely exceeded 30 feet, that she orchestrated events designed not to kill but to terrify, an art form perfected over decades of suffering, observation, and patience. On January 17, 1960, she executed what would become legendary, a campaign so simple in appearance, yet so devastating in effect, it would haunt veterans for the rest of their lives. 5,000 women emerged from the shadows of villages, bamboo sticks carved to mimic rifles, moving with synchronization and precision that defied expectation. Soldiers trained in modern warfare, taught to rely on drills, technology, and fire superiority, froze in disbelief. Their senses, honed for logic and strategy, were overwhelmed by a force that operated on instinct, myth, and terror. Dinh had created a weapon they could not counter, the human mind pushed to its breaking point. This operation was more than a tactical maneuver. It was an experiment in the calculus of fear. Dinh understood that terror spreads in patterns, like wildfire or disease. Panic among a few soldiers infected the rest. Orders lost meaning. Weapons, expensive and sophisticated, were abandoned. Discipline collapsed under the weight of what the human brain cannot rationalize, something that seems impossible but is undeniably real. Every soldier who fled carried the story back to the next unit, seeding the legend and amplifying the effect exponentially. But the genius and horror of Nguyen Thi Dinh lay not only in this orchestration but in her understanding of perception. She weaponized cultural fears, tapping into local myths and primal human instincts. Shadows became predators, whispers became threats, and every sound and movement she orchestrated forced soldiers to confront a reality that did not follow the rules of their training. What the Americans faced was not just resistance. It was a psychological symphony, composed with the precision of a master, designed to fracture confidence and warp reality itself. And it worked. Entire units abandoned fortified positions, leaving equipment, weapons, even communications behind. Reports later described the scene as surreal, almost supernatural. Yet Dinh's approach was grounded in human nature, not magic. She had internalized centuries of fear and oppression and transformed them into a methodology so effective that intelligence officers would spend years trying and failing to quantify her influence. The lesson was brutal and clear. The greatest weapon is not in the hands but in the mind, and Nguyen Thi Dinh had mastered it completely. By the mid-1960s, Nguyen Thi Dinh had moved beyond small-scale ambushes or isolated acts of terror. She had built a network, a system, a machine of psychological control that reached into every village, river, and jungle corridor of the Mekong Delta. Her tactics were no longer merely reactive. They were proactive, premeditated, almost surgical in their precision. She understood that armies could be outgunned, but populations' minds could be shaped, broken, and directed with an artistry far more terrifying than bullets. Dinh's operations were carefully engineered studies of human behavior under extreme stress. She deployed rumors, legends, and orchestrated incidents to create a constant, inescapable tension. Villagers learned fear as a language. Soldiers learned that their own training could betray them. By the time a unit encountered her women's brigades, the seed of terror had already been planted through whispers, stories, and subtle manipulations. Dinh had created an invisible battlefield, one that existed before engagement, one where victory was guaranteed because the enemy had been psychologically disarmed long before weapons were drawn. Her brilliance was in the layering. Sensory deprivation, isolation, and misinformation were tools she had studied firsthand in French prisons. She weaponized them across landscapes, integrating knowledge of cultural psychology with battlefield strategy. She understood that the anticipation of violence could be more destructive than the act itself, that fear could ripple like water, infecting minds faster than bullets ever could. A single encounter with her forces left men trembling, shaking, haunted by the certainty that the jungle itself was alive with unseen threats. And here is where she crossed into legend. Her psychological operations were codified, applied, and adapted every event observed, every reaction catalogued, every misstep corrected. By manipulating perception, controlling information, and orchestrating uncertainty, she rendered conventional military power obsolete. Entire American units reported abandoning positions in disbelief, convinced they were outnumbered by forces that could not exist. This was no luck, no coincidence. It was Dinh's lifelong study of fear, perfected in the crucible of personal trauma and decades of disciplined observation. Now, I want you to engage with this truth directly. In the comments, write twice, "I see the shadows." Let this be your acknowledgement that you are beginning to perceive the machinery of control, to recognize how fear can be cultivated, manipulated, and weaponized. Writing it twice is not ritual, it is commitment. You are not just a spectator. You are a witness to knowledge deliberately hidden, and by naming it, you lock it into your own consciousness. The system sees those who see it. The system fears those who understand it. Dinh's mastery was total. She understood that the mind is both battlefield and arsenal, and by controlling perception, she could shape outcomes without firing a single shot. What governments fail to grasp and still fail to admit is that some wars are won not through firepower, but through the meticulous, calculated application of fear itself. Nguyen Thi Dinh had turned human terror into a weapon, and in the Mekong Delta, it was sharper, faster, and deadlier than any rifle. By the late 1960s, Nguyen Thi Dinh had become a phantom in the eyes of American intelligence. Reports arrived with urgency, written in the sterile language of bureaucracy, attempting to explain phenomena that defied conventional logic. Entire platoons disappeared from fortified positions without a single shot fired. Soldiers described apparitions, movements too precise, too coordinated to be natural. Superstitions whispered among troops became classified intelligence. Yet Dinh herself remained invisible, always several steps ahead, orchestrating chaos like a conductor who could bend reality through perception alone. What terrified the Americans and what they refused to acknowledge publicly was the methodology behind it. This was not random terror. This was systematic, data-driven, psychological engineering. Every encounter, every ambush, every whispered rumor was premeditated, designed to maximize disruption. She studied the enemy the same way she had studied prisoners, villagers, and soldiers under French rule. Profiles of weakness, responses catalogued, triggers analyzed. Fear became a virus, infection measured and spread with precision. And she had perfected the transmission vectors. The jungle itself was her laboratory, the Mekong Delta a testing ground for what could be called the most sophisticated psychological campaign in modern warfare. Dinh understood something few generals ever grasp. The greatest victories are often invisible. Bodies left behind are irrelevant. Morale shattered, trust broken, confidence annihilated, that is the true triumph. American troops, trained for conventional war, were unprepared for an opponent who fought with shadows, whispers, and the anticipation of terror itself. They sought her through patrols, airstrikes, interrogations, but each attempt was anticipated, countered, absorbed into her larger pattern. Her forces vanished into the landscape the same way fear had once vanished through the villages she had grown up in. Silent, inexorable, and impossible to confront directly. The mythology surrounding her began to spread. Intelligence officers refused to put her name in reports. She became the woman who cannot be named, a phenomenon too dangerous to describe in detail. Stories emerged. Soldiers waking screaming in the night, haunted by visions that may not have been dreams at all. Entire units lost cohesion before engagement. And yet, for all her infamy, Dinh was not supernatural. She was entirely human, an architect of terror, sculptor of fear, master of the invisible forces that shape reality. Governments could not contain her legend because it existed not on maps, not in borders, but in the minds of those who encountered her. Her work teaches a chilling truth. the most terrifying weapons are not guns or bombs. They are knowledge, perception, and the ability to manipulate the deepest instincts of the human mind. And in that lesson, Nguyen Thi Dinh remains unmatched. She forced entire armies to confront the fragility of their own minds and demonstrated that control over perception can outweigh control over terrain, firepower, or numbers. History may try to erase her, but the impact of her strategies, fear, manipulation, psychological domination remains etched into the human story, invisible yet undeniable, terrifying yet instructive. Nguyen Thi Dinh's life was not a story of heroism in the conventional sense. It was a study in the anatomy of fear, a blueprint for domination of the human mind that few have ever witnessed and even fewer understand. By the time the 1970s rolled in, she had become a living paradox. Both revered and reviled, a symbol of resistance, yet a master of terror so precise that her own people feared the power she wielded. She did not merely fight. She engineered outcomes before combat began, bending reality to her will through perception, manipulation, and the inexorable pressure of fear. What she achieved in the Mekong Delta, in the dense labyrinth of waterways and jungles, was more than military victory. It was an experiment on human consciousness. Entire villages, entire units, entire armies became instruments in her psychological calculus, reacting predictably under pressure she had carefully calibrated. She proved that control over fear, over expectation, over belief itself, can be more decisive than firepower, strategy, or numbers. She exposed the fragility of confidence, the vulnerability of training, and the astonishing speed with which panic can cascade through even the most disciplined human system. And yet, her genius carried a moral ambiguity that few can stomach. She weaponized knowledge of the mind, turning trauma into a tool, loss into leverage, and human instinct into an uncontrollable force. She understood that the mind could be both battlefield and arsenal, and she exploited this truth with surgical precision. In doing so, she forced a lesson that remains suppressed in textbooks and intelligence reports. Fear, properly understood and applied, can be more lethal than any bullet. She transformed psychological insight into an instrument of power, a lesson the most advanced armies in history struggled to comprehend. For those listening now, the final truth is unsettling. Nguyen Thi Dinh was more than a commander. She was an architect of human reality. She forced those who faced her to confront the limitations of perception, the fragility of certainty, and the terrifying power of an individual who understands fear as a system, not a reaction. And this is the lesson she leaves for us, centuries removed yet never truly gone. The most dangerous forces are invisible, residing in thought, expectation, and belief. Power is not only in what you can destroy, but in what you can shape, bend, and anticipate before it even happens. Remember what you've witnessed. Write it in your mind. Let it settle like a shadow you cannot shake. Some knowledge changes you irrevocably, and now, having seen the architecture of terror, you cannot unsee it. Nguyen Thi Dinh did not merely alter the course of history. She altered the way humans perceive fear, control, and the unseen mechanisms of domination. This is knowledge the powerful have long tried to bury, and now it is yours. Remember, some knowledge changes you forever. Subscribe if you want the rest of history's forbidden truths, hidden agendas, and shadow wars revealed. This is the knowledge they never wanted you to see.